You're useless. You hear me? Useless. I have been paying you for 6 years to do one thing, and you can't even do that. Get out. Get out of my conference room. I'm done with you. Bradley Voss's voice carried through the glass walls of the executive conference room on the 38th floor of Voss Logistics, picked up by every person on the trading floor below and by the 4 members of his C-suite seated around the table in front of him. The black IT director, standing in the doorway, did not respond. He did not defend himself. He looked at Voss for one long, quiet second, the way a person looks at a man who has just done something he cannot quite take back. Then he turned. He walked out of the conference room. He walked past the trading floor. He took the elevator to the 12th floor where the IT department lived, and he stood for 30 seconds outside his own office door, his hand on the knob, breathing. Then he opened the door, sat down at his desk, and began to gather his personal effects into a cardboard box. His name was Theodore Mensa. He was 43 years old. He had been the company's senior IT director for 6 years. And in approximately 7 minutes, the company's primary database server was going to attempt a scheduled migration to a new hardware cluster, a migration he had spent the last 14 months personally architecting. And the credentials required to authorize that migration existed in exactly one place in the world, inside his head. 18 years earlier, Theodore Mensa had arrived in the United States from Accra, carrying a single suitcase, a worn copy of a Knuth volume his uncle had given him as a graduation gift, and the address of a cousin who lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He had been 25. He had a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Ghana, 3 years of work experience as a systems administrator at a regional bank in Accra, and a particular relationship with computers that had begun when he was 12. And his grandfather, a retired schoolmaster, had bought him a used 386 from a Lebanese trader in Kumasi for an amount of money that had represented in Theodore's grandfather's pension 2 months of careful saving. Theodore had not asked for the computer. His grandfather had bought it because he had observed, with the careful attention of a man who had spent 40 years watching children figure out what they were for, that his grandson had a habit of taking apart radios. The 386 had not been an obvious step up from radios, but Theodore had taken it apart anyway, had put it back together, and had then, with the kind of patient, methodical curiosity that would shape the next 30 years of his life, taught himself to program in BASIC, then in C, then in everything else, on whatever discarded manuals he could find at the second-hand bookstore 3 streets over. He had spent his first 3 years in America working night shifts as a help desk technician for a regional insurance company in Hartford, while attending Quinnipiac University part-time for a master's degree in information systems. He had earned the degree at 28. He had moved through 3 companies in the next decade, each move a careful upward step in scope and responsibility, and had landed at Voss Logistics 6 years before the morning of the conference room. He had been hired by the previous chief technology officer, a man named Alan Park, who had retired 18 months later and had been replaced by Bradley Voss's brother-in-law, a man named Greg Hemley, whose previous experience consisted primarily of having been Bradley Voss's brother-in-law. Theodore had stayed. He had stayed because the work was interesting, because his team of 11 engineers and analysts was, in his careful judgment, one of the best he had ever assembled, and because the migration project he had begun designing in his 3rd year at the company had grown, by his 6th year, into something he was professionally unwilling to walk away from before completion. The migration was the largest infrastructure project in the company's 26-year history. It would consolidate 17 aging database servers, running on hardware some of which dated to 2009, onto a modern clustered architecture that would reduce the company's annual infrastructure costs by an estimated $4.2 million and would, more importantly, eliminate a category of single point of failure risks that Theodore had been quietly mitigating with duct tape and overtime for 4 years. The migration had a hard cutover scheduled for that morning at 9:30 a.m. By 9:35, every transactional database the company depended on for its 1,100-employee logistics operation would be running on the new cluster, or, if something went wrong, would not be running at all. Bradley Voss was 58 years old. He had inherited Voss Logistics from his father in 2011 and had grown it with the help of the tailwind in the regional shipping market and the steady professional work of a leadership bench he tended to take credit for From a $40 million regional carrier to a $420 million company that served customers across the eastern United States, Bradley had a degree from a small liberal arts college his father had also attended. He had not finished business school. He believed in the foundational way that men of his particular type tended to believe, that he had built the company himself. He believed, secondarily, that the people who worked for him were either contributing to that achievement or were freeloading on it, and that the distinction between the two categories was something he could identify on sight. He had a particular blind spot, well known to everyone in the company except himself, regarding technical staff. He did not understand what they did. He did not want to understand what they did. He understood only that they cost money, that they occasionally caused problems by making him aware of issues he would have preferred not to be made aware of, and that they wore, in his opinion, inappropriate clothing to work. Theodore Mensa had been wearing a button-down shirt and slacks every day for 6 years. Bradley had once remarked in front of 3 other executives that Theodore at least made an effort, in a tone that had not been a compliment, and that Theodore had filed away with the other observations he kept in the careful inner ledger every black professional of his generation maintained without quite naming the document to themselves. The 9 a.m. meeting on the 38th floor that morning had been called by Bradley to discuss what he had described in the calendar invitation as the customer portal situation. The customer portal was a public-facing web application Voss Logistics used to allow its clients to track shipments. The portal had been experiencing intermittent slowness for the past 3 weeks. The cause of the slowness was, as Theodore had explained to Bradley in writing 4 separate times, that the portal was hosted on legacy infrastructure scheduled for retirement that very morning. After the 9:30 migration, the portal would be running on the new cluster, and the slowness would be resolved. Theodore had communicated this in an email on the 14th. He had communicated it again in person to Bradley's chief of staff on the 17th. He had communicated it again in the executive briefing memo distributed on the 22nd. He had communicated it for a 4th time in a follow-up email to Bradley personally on the 28th, in which he had also included a 1-paragraph summary of the migration plan and the exact time at which the cutover would occur. Bradley had not read any of these communications carefully. Bradley had, however, that morning, received a phone call from one of the company's largest customers, a regional grocery chain with a $50 million annual contract. Complaining that the customer portal had taken 17 seconds to load a shipping query, Bradley had hung up the phone, walked into his 9 o'clock meeting, and proceeded to spend the next 22 minutes berating Theodore for what he had described variously as this nonsense, this incompetence, and this black box bullshit you keep throwing at me. The other 3 executives in the room, the CFO, the COO, and the chief of staff, had sat in the particular silence well-paid executives maintain when their CEO is publicly humiliating an employee and they have calculated that defending the employee will produce no benefit and considerable cost. The CFO had stared at her notebook. The COO had stared at the ceiling. The chief of staff, a young woman named Allison, who had been at the company for 2 years and who had, in private, twice raised concerns with HR about Bradley's interaction patterns with technical staff, had gripped her pen hard enough that the casing had cracked slightly along one seam. Theodore had taken the abuse for 22 minutes. He had not argued. He had not raised his voice. He had, twice, attempted to explain that the migration scheduled for 9:30 would resolve the customer portal performance issue, and both times Bradley had cut him off with the same dismissive wave of his hand. At the 23rd minute, when Bradley had picked up Theodore's project status report from the conference table, looked at it for 2 seconds, and dropped it onto the floor with the comment that it was useless paperwork from a useless department, Theodore had stood up. He had not stood up to fight. He had stood up because he had reached the inner limit beyond which he had decided 6 years earlier he would not be required by any salary to remain. He had said, very quietly, "Mr. Voss, I have explained the situation 4 times in writing and twice this morning. I am going to leave this meeting now. I have a server migration scheduled in approximately 8 minutes that requires my attention. I would appreciate it if we could continue this conversation after 11 o'clock when the migration is complete." Bradley had risen from his chair. His face had gone the color of port wine. "You'll leave this meeting when I dismiss you. Sit down." He had remained standing. He had said, with the same quiet evenness, "Mr. Voss, with respect. The migration window is scheduled. If I miss it, The cutover will need to be rescheduled. That will be expensive. I will return after the migration to address whatever concerns you would like to raise. It was at this moment that Bradley had said the words that the chief of staff would later, in her sworn statement to the company's outside investigators, identify as the precise turning point of the morning. You're useless. You hear me? Useless. I have been paying you for 6 years to do one thing, and you can't even do that. Get out. Get out of my conference room. I'm done with you. You're fired. Pack your shit and get out of my building. I'll have HR send you the paperwork. The conference room had gone silent. The CFO had closed her notebook. Theodore had looked at Bradley for one long, quiet second. He had said, "Mr. Voss, are you certain?" "Get out." Theodore had nodded once. Very slightly, he had walked out. He had taken the elevator to the 12th floor. He had stood for 30 seconds outside his office door. He had not done what he wanted to do, which was to take out his phone and call his wife. He had instead opened the door, sat down at his desk, and begun, with the same methodical patience his grandfather had taught him, to gather his personal effects into the cardboard box he kept under his desk for exactly this kind of contingency. He had been gathering personal effects into cardboard boxes, in his quiet inner imagination, for 6 years. The box was real. He had bought it on his first day at the company. At 9:27, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his deputy, a careful woman named Priya Krishnan, who had been with the team for 4 years. The text read, "Pre-migration check is green. Cutover starts in 3 minutes. Are you on the floor?" Theodore looked at the text for 2 seconds. He typed back, "On the 12th. Box packing." There was a long pause. Then Priya's reply came. "What?" Theodore typed, "Long story. Run the cutover. You have the run book? Call me if there are issues. I am not technically employed here at the moment." He set the phone down. He continued packing. He took the framed photograph of his wife and their 2 daughters off the shelf. He took the small wooden carving of an elephant his uncle had given him in Accra. He took the 4 certifications he had earned over the years and which he kept on his wall not from vanity but because his eldest daughter had asked when she was 6 whether her father was important, and he had pointed to the certifications and said yes. He took the book his grandfather had given him in 1991, the Warren Knuth volume, which had been on his desk for 6 years, and which Bradley had once picked up, looked at, and put back down without comment because it had not appeared to Bradley to be relevant to anything. At 9 hours 30 minutes and 14 seconds, his phone began to ring. It was Priya. He answered. "What's wrong?" "The new cluster is rejecting the credential bundle. It's prompting for the master service account password." Theodore closed his eyes. He had built the new cluster's authentication system himself. The master service account password was the keystone credential, the one credential that authenticated the migration daemon to the new hardware, which then in turn authorized the entire 17-server cutover sequence. He had stored the password in the company's enterprise password manager. Access to that password required 2-factor authentication and was restricted to the senior IT director, a role currently vacated by the events of the previous 24 minutes, and to a backup administrator account whose holder had been, 6 weeks earlier, the deputy CTO Greg Henley, who had taken indefinite medical leave for a back surgery and was, at this exact moment, recovering at his sister's house in Vermont with a post-operative narcotic regimen that made his retrieval of any password in the next 48 hours functionally impossible. The password existed in exactly 2 places in the world that mattered. It existed in the Enterprise Password Manager, accessible only to Theodore, and it existed in Theodore's head. He said, into the phone, "Priya, listen carefully. The master service account credential is in the vault under my account. I am, as of approximately 25 minutes ago, no longer an employee of this company. My credentials may or may not still be valid. If you attempt to access the vault under my account and the access has been revoked, the system will lock you out for 2 hours per the security protocol. We cannot afford that. The 17 legacy servers have already begun their decommissioning sequence and cannot be reversed. If the migration does not complete within the next 11 minutes, the company's production database environment will be in a state where neither the old nor the new cluster is operational. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Do not attempt the vault. Do not page Greg. Page Bradley. Tell him I need to be reinstated in writing within the next 3 minutes, and that I need to be physically back at my desk within 5. He may not believe you. Tell him the production database environment is about to go dark. Tell him I am the only person who can prevent that. He looked at the cardboard box. He waited. At 9 hours, 33 minutes and 42 seconds, the elevator on the 12th floor opened. Bradley Voss stepped out at a near run. He had taken the stairs 2 flights before the elevator caught him. His chief of staff was 3 steps behind him. The CFO was 3 steps behind her. The COO had remained on the 38th floor. On the theory, which he would later describe to his wife as the smartest decision of his professional life, that he did not particularly need to be in the room for what was about to happen. Bradley arrived at Theodore's office. He stopped in the doorway. He was breathing hard. He looked at the cardboard box. He looked at Theodore. He looked at the cardboard box again. His mouth was open slightly. He said, "Theodore, Theodore looked up from his desk. He did not stand. He said very quietly, "Mr. Voss, I understand we have a situation. The database, the new system," Priya said. "I know what Priya said, Mr. Voss. I am the one who told her to call you. The migration is in a transitional state. The legacy servers have begun decommissioning. The new cluster is awaiting credentials I am the only person who currently possesses. We have approximately 7 minutes before the company's production database environment is in a state from which recovery will require, at best, 12 hours, and at worst, 3 days. I would like to help. I cannot help, while I am, per your statement of 28 minutes ago, no longer employed here. I would like, before I help, to be reinstated. In writing. I would also like a number of other things which we can discuss after the migration is complete." Bradley Voss had not had a conversation like this in his life. The chief of staff, behind him, had already taken her tablet out and was opening the company's HR system. The CFO behind her had pulled out her phone and was, with the kind of careful expression of a woman who had been a CFO for 11 years and knew when to act without instruction, looking up the section of Theodore's compensation contract that addressed severance and notice. Bradley said, yes, reinstated. Of course, Theodore. I would like that in writing, Mr. Voss." The chief of staff was already typing. Within 40 seconds, an email arrived in Theodore's inbox, time-stamped 9 hours, 34 minutes, and 31 seconds a.m., copying the CFO, the chief of staff, and the head of HR. The email was 3 sentences long. It read, "Effective immediately, Theodore Mensa is reinstated to his position as Senior IT Director with no break in service and no loss of compensation or benefits. The termination communicated to Mr. Mensa at approximately 9:23 a.m. today is rescinded in full. This action is taken by me, Bradley Voss, in my capacity as Chief Executive Officer, and is irrevocable." Theodore read the email. He read it twice. He said, "Thank you." He stood up. He walked past Bradley in the doorway without making eye contact. He walked to the IT Operations Center 2 doors down the hall. He sat down at the Senior Administrator workstation. He authenticated with his employee credentials, which the Chief of Staff had not yet revoked because she had not been instructed to. He authenticated with his 2-factor device. He retrieved the master service account password from the vault. He typed it, by hand, into the migration daemon's authentication prompt. Because the password was 32 characters long, and Theodore had memorized it during the architecture phase of the project the previous fall, on a long flight to a vendor meeting in Phoenix, by saying it under his breath every 15 minutes for the duration of the flight. He hit enter. The migration daemon authenticated. The new cluster accepted the handshake. The cutover sequence resumed. By 9 hours, 41 minutes, and 18 seconds, the migration was complete. By 9 hours, 41 minutes, and 34 seconds, the customer portal was loading shipping queries in under 400 milliseconds. By 9 hours, 42 minutes, and 0 seconds, every transactional database in the company was running on the new cluster, on schedule, on budget, with 0 data loss and 0 customer-facing downtime. Bradley Voss had not left the 12th floor. Theodore turned in his chair. He looked at Bradley. He said, "The migration is complete. The customer portal is running correctly. The performance complaint from this morning is resolved. I would like to discuss the other matters now." The other matters were discussed in a 4-hour meeting in the company's HR director's office, with the CFO present, with the chief of staff present, with the head of HR present, and with Bradley Voss present in the way a man is present in a room when he is realized several hours too late that he has lost control of a situation in his own building. Theodore's lawyer joined by video conference for the final 90 minutes. The terms reached by the end of that meeting included, in summary, a formal written apology from Bradley Voss to be delivered to Theodore Mensa and entered in his personnel file. The establishment of a new senior position, Chief Information Officer, reporting directly to the board rather than to the CEO, for which Theodore was the only candidate considered and to which he was promoted effective the following Monday. A salary increase reflecting the new role, an equity grant, a multi-year retention bonus structured to vest over 4 years, a written commitment by the board to commission an outside investigation of Bradley Voss's conduct toward technical and operational staff, the scope of which was negotiated between Theodore's lawyer and the board's outside counsel over the following 3 weeks, and the resignation of Bradley Voss as CEO 6 months later, after the outside investigation concluded that his conduct had constituted, per the report's careful language, a sustained pattern of professional behavior incompatible with the duties of the office. He was permitted to retain his board seat as the company's largest shareholder. The board chair role was taken over by an independent director the board had been quietly courting for 2 years. Theodore did not become CEO. He had not wanted to. He had become, however, the senior technical voice in the company, with a reporting line that bypassed the executive he no longer worked for, and with a mandate to do, across all of Voss Logistics' operations, the careful, patient work he had been doing on the database migration for the previous 14 months. The $4.2 million in annual infrastructure savings the migration delivered was the first item Theodore put on the table at the board meeting 6 weeks later, when he presented a 3-year technology investment plan that the board approved unanimously and that the new chair described in her opening remarks at the following annual shareholder meeting as the most coherent technology strategy this company has ever seen. Priya Krishnan was promoted to deputy CIO. The other 10 members of Theodore's team received, the following quarter, the first across-the-board compensation adjustment any of them had seen in 3 years. The young chief of staff, Allison, who had typed the reinstatement email at 9:34 a.m. and who had, over the following months, become one of Theodore's most reliable internal allies, was promoted to a vice president role in operations within 18 months. She would later describe, in a profile published in a trade magazine 4 years after the incident, the morning of the reinstatement as the moment I learned that nothing in a company actually works the way the org chart says it works, and that the people who keep the lights on are almost never the people sitting in the conference room above. 3 years after the morning of the conference room, Theodore Mensa was invited to give the commencement address at the master's program he had attended at Quinnipiac 21 years earlier. He did not talk about the database migration. He did not talk about Bradley Voss. He talked instead about his grandfather and about the used 386 his grandfather had bought him for 2 months of pension money in Kumasi in 1991. He told the audience that his grandfather had given him that day 3 things: a computer, a Knuth volume he had not opened until the following year, and a sentence in Twi that translated approximately, "As the work will know you even when the people in the room do not." He had not understood the sentence at 12. He had understood it at 25. He had understood it more deeply at 43, on a particular morning in a conference room on a 38th floor. The Knuth volume sat, that afternoon, on the desk in his new corner office at Voss Logistics, beside the framed photograph of his wife and his daughters, and the small wooden elephant from Accra. The cardboard box he had packed that morning was gone. He had taken it home that evening, the day of the incident, and his wife had emptied its contents back onto his shelves, with the careful, unhurried patience of a woman who had been married to him for 16 years and who had known, the first time she had heard him describe Bradley Voss after their first meeting, exactly how the story was going to end.